Good evening, everyone, and welcome to NCEA's Understanding the National Standards and Benchmarks for Effective Catholic Elementary and Secondary Schools webinar. My name is Kate Reich, and I am on hand for today's webinar to help with any technical questions that you may have. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping matters to share with you. First, please know that all of your microphone connections with today's webinar have been muted. During the presentation, you may ask questions or provide comments for the presenters by using the chat and/or question functions located in the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. We're also having a conversation online at todaysmeet.com. I'm sending out the link via the chat function and invite you to join us at todaysmeet.com/CSSOZAR14 for posting questions and comments. However, if you'd still like to use the GoToWebinar panel question, please do so by clicking the question bubble. Click into the blank box area and enter your question using your keyboard and then click send. Second, the webinar presentation will run for 45 to 50 minutes, leaving some time at the end for the presenters to answer any questions that you have provided. Third, today's webinar will feature 2 polls. To answer the poll questions, use your mouse to make your selection, then click Submit. Fourth, you will be asked to complete a brief evaluation at the end of this webinar, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and you will all receive a copy of the final recorded webinar that we will email to you once those recorded files are available. I'm very pleased to present Kathy Mears, Executive Director of the NCEA Elementary Schools Department, and Dr. Lorraine Ozar, Director of the Center for Catholic School Effectiveness at Loyola University Chicago. Both Kathy and Dr. Ozar present a wealth of experience from both the design and practitioner aspects of the national standards, and we are very pleased that you all could join us for this overview presentation. Please welcome Kathy and Lorraine.
Good evening. Thank you, Kate. This is Lorraine Ozar. It's an honor and a privilege for me to be with you this evening. As one of the lead authors of the National Standards and Benchmarks, I am always delighted to have an opportunity to share more of the good news about what these have to offer Catholic schools and how we can use them. With me tonight is my friend and colleague, Kathy Mears.
Thank you, Lorraine, and thank you, Kate. We are very glad to be with you, as Dr. Ozar said, and our contact information is now on your screen. Please feel free to use it. Both Dr. Ozar and I will return your email. It may take a day or two, but we will return the, we want to stay in contact with the very important people who are doing all the hard work in the field. We do have a Today's Meet, like Kate suggested, and there it is. Again, I urge you to go there so that you can leave questions, comments. It's very helpful to put your questions and comments there. Some of them I can answer, and then that just saves time. And it also provides us a place where we can go back a month from now and look and see what we said, what our questions were, and maybe most importantly what the answers are. So this is different from the chat box that Kate described because you won't have access to that in a month, but you will have access to the Today's Meet account. So please go to todaysmeet.com/CSS, which is Catholic School Standards, OZAR 14. And if you can go to that site and start leaving your questions, your thoughts, your comments, it will be very helpful to you and to us. Then I think we're ready to move forward. We have 2 polls, and the first one is we want to know what you know about the standards. So Kate, if you could put the poll up. If you're very familiar with the standards, please mark that. Maybe you just know that the standards exist. You've seen a book, you've seen a copy of them around, or you're thinking, what standards? My principal told me to be here. Whatever the case may be, please let us know where you are in the standards, and we'll close the poll in just a second, and then we'll be able to see what your knowledge level is. And this is helpful, so when Lorraine's presenting, she can go back and we'll tell her the results, and she will adjust. She's a very good teacher, and she knows how to differentiate. So what are our results here, Kate? Very familiar is 42%. That's great. You guys are a little bit ahead of the 4 o'clock group, that West Coast. Aware that the standards exist is 55%, and what standards are 3%. If you're saying what standards, don't feel alone. Trust me, there are people who probably should have marked that and they didn't. So we're good that you're here. Our next poll, we want to know about you, okay? Who are you? Are you an elementary teacher, a secondary teacher, elementary school administrator, secondary school administrator, or other? And you know what? The other, please let us know in today's meet. Last time our others was we had a director of a foundation, and we had several assistant superintendents. So if you are other, please let us know in today's meet who you are, okay? And I very much appreciate that you're doing that. And Kate, if you can close that poll out and let us know the results. Oh, more than half of you are elementary school teachers. Excellent. We have 17% secondary teachers. And then elementary school administrators 14%, and secondary school administrators 6%, and then other is 6%. And again, other, if you can please go to todaysmeet.com/CSSOZAR14, we'll find out who you are. So thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to the wonderful Dr. Lorraine Ozar.
Thank you, Kathy. It's very helpful to know who is out there tonight across the country. This webinar session is what we might call a Tier 1 session on the national standards, designed to help participants understand where the standards came from and why they are important to Catholic schools, to learn more about what's in the standards, and then to consider how schools and dioceses can use the national standards to expand excellence and increase effectiveness. For that last goal, in the second half of the webinar, we'll be giving many examples of what's happening around the country, and even in some cases the world, as Catholic educators at all levels are implementing these standards and benchmarks. Now, for many of you who are already familiar, some of what I'm going to be saying you may already know, but hopefully going through this again tonight will give you some more language, some more examples, some more ways to share this information with your stakeholders. Many of us who are working on the national standards and benchmarks have started referring to them as a GPS to help us build and sustain excellent Catholic schools. As with any GPS, you need to be able to enter the endpoint, the destination, and also your current position. And then you're given a route, or maybe several routes, to get to the destination. The national standards provide us with that endpoint, with a clearly articulated, research-based description of an excellent Catholic school. We can use the benchmarks and the accompanying rubrics, which we will talk about, to locate our school's current position, performance, if you will, and then engage our stakeholders in creating action plans to sustain and improve our schools, sort of build the routes to get to the final destination. And I must say, as we all know from using a GPS, we need to exercise intelligence when we do it, because not all routes work equally well for all drivers. So, not to press this metaphor too much, we're thinking that the standards and benchmarks give us clear direction about what should be in place in our schools. But each school community and diocese needs to operationalize those directions in the context of their own community and specific mission. So let's look a little bit at where the standards came from and why they're important. In 2009, Loyola University Chicago hosted a Catholic higher education conference, a CHEC conference, that included a cross-section of Catholic educators to consider how can Catholic higher education help Catholic elementary and secondary schools? How can we be of service and assistance? The #1 proposal for action that came out of that conference was to develop a set of national standards describing agreed upon non-negotiable characteristics for excellent and effective pre-K-12 Catholic schools. Now, we talked about a lot of reasons about why would having a set of such standards and benchmarks make a difference. Here are some of the reasons. First of all, a set of standards and benchmarks could help us clarify what is an effective Catholic school across dioceses, regions, across the country, sort of to build the brand of Catholic education. Standards and benchmarks can help provide a framework for improvement. As I travel around the country, and I'm sure as you go to national meetings, you know that the issues and challenges that Catholic schools face come up again and again in different contexts, but similar challenges. Having a common framework of what is that destination, what is that excellence we're seeking, can help us collaborate better in sharing ideas and innovations for strategies for improvement. A third reason would be to help Catholic institutions of higher education. That's what that funny CIHE stands for. To help Catholic institutions of higher education build their professional programs, their leadership programs for Catholic school educators, their professional development and consulting and so on, to help them build and design it around what's really needed. So if we agree on what people in Catholic schools are trying to do, what they're building in the schools, we in Catholic higher ed could be in a better position to support that. A fourth reason would be to enhance public policy. Again, if we have a common vision and descriptors, then the groups across the country who are working on school choice and other kinds of things that will benefit our Catholic schools would have a basis for articulating needs and directions. Another reason is to provide a platform for accreditation. Now, those of you who are familiar with the standards and benchmarks know that they themselves do not constitute a protocol for accreditation, but they give a basis on which you can then develop protocols for accreditation, accreditation instruments and tools, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the implementation piece. And then finally, there was a sense that a set of national standards and benchmarks could help increase funders' confidence in school capacity for sustainable improvements. So if funders know that we have a clear vision of what excellence is and can identify where our school is in relation to that vision, we have a sense that given the resources, given the assistance, we know how to get where we need to go. So given that, we developed a national task force comprised of superintendents, higher education folks, some members of religious congregations, corporate sponsors, who worked over 2 years to develop drafts and then to give them out to the larger Catholic education community to review and to vet and then to redraft. We did that over 2 years. We vetted the drafts with CASE, with the Catholic Higher Education Collaborative Group, with the NCEA, with all members of the NCEA at the convention. And then we sent out what was close to a final draft to some bishops and national leadership so that we could be sure we were getting all the voices we needed. In March of 2012, Loyola University Chicago published the standards. They have been assuming great significance, and as more people begin, more dioceses, more schools begin to and continue to implement them, the significance is very clear. These standards and benchmarks really are serving many as a blueprint for governing bodies, school leaders and stakeholders, dioceses, to really look at how to structure school growth and improvement. Now, we can say, didn't we have standards before? And I want to be very clear, I've said this many times, the creation of these standards and benchmarks was not to suggest that Catholic schools did not have standards. And I think Michael Garanzini, the president and CEO of Loyola University Chicago, sort of encapsulated this idea very well in something he wrote in Momentum when the standards first came out. He said, a vision of quality is not something we need to invent. We know what quality is. We know in our schools when our students are getting a really fine education, when they've got excellent instruction, when we've got dynamite teachers, and we know when, for whatever reason, sometimes things aren't up to snuff and we're not doing the best job we can. We know that. We know what quality looks like. But Father Garanzini's statement, which I think really applies, is that until now, we as a Catholic community of educators have not had an agreed upon set of standards to which we could hold ourselves accountable. And I think that's the heart of the matter. This is a set of common, agreed upon, research-based criteria that we can all use for many things. And we'll be exploring some of those things this evening. So let's do a brief overview of what is in the standards and benchmarks. There are 9 defining characteristics of Catholic schools, 13 standards, and 70 benchmarks. The defining characteristics flow from the Church's teaching on Catholic schools. We went to those documents to be sure that that was the starting point. These characteristics define the deep Catholic identity of Catholic schools and serve as the platform on which the whole standards and benchmarks rest. Here are the defining characteristics, and since many of you are familiar with the standards, you've seen them. You've probably talked about them, maybe begun to identify how you're using them in your school. Together, these 9 characteristics encompass a powerful articulation of the Catholic identity of Catholic schools. This is what you need to find in the school if it deserves the name Catholic. So for example, if I started with that very first defining characteristic centered in the person of Jesus Christ, what these standards, what these defining characteristics rather are saying is that if I went into a school and I couldn't find Jesus, then it's not a Catholic school, no matter what name is on the door. Similarly, if I looked at that third characteristic, distinguished by excellence, what it would mean is, to me, that if I go into a school and not all the adults are committed to continuous improvement to assure that every child meets high expectations, then we've got work to do. And I'm not comfortable calling this a really excellent Catholic school. It's not living up to that defining characteristic. I think these defining characteristics are a powerful gift to us in the Catholic community now. We don't need to keep asking, well, what does it mean to be a Catholic school anyway? What is our Catholic identity? Have you been in those conversations where people are talking and they say, well, what do we mean by Catholic identity anyway? And we go through the same cycles. I'm getting very comfortable now that these are out and I see how people are using them and the difference they can make in saying, we don't need to ask that anymore. This is the Catholic identity of our schools. This is the core of it. So we don't need to spend our time pulling out those characteristics, but rather we can spend our time reflecting on them and describing with our communities, with our stakeholders, how each of these defining characteristics shows itself in your school, my school. And what can we do to make them even more pervasive and more apparent? A powerful set of statements that we have to work with. After the defining characteristics, there are, in the document, 13 standards, which describe the policies, programs, structures, and processes that should be present in mission-driven, program-effective, well-managed, and responsibly governed Catholic schools that are operating consistent with the defining characteristics. So as you know, these are school effectiveness standards. They're not curriculum standards. They don't tell us what students should be learning in math in second grade. They support curriculum standards, but they're not curriculum standards. They're looking at all of the dimensions of an excellent, effective Catholic school. And then there are 70 benchmarks providing observable, measurable descriptors for each standard. So for each standard, there are between 3 and 10 benchmarks. And these benchmarks, because they are observable and measurable, provide a solid base for developing things like accreditation tools, self-assessment and diagnostic instruments, data collecting and reporting structures. They're not accreditation tools, but they can be the basis for creating them. And the benchmarks are what really tie us in very closely to that metaphor of the GPS, marking our location so that we can then begin to develop a clear path on how to move forward. So let's take a few minutes then to look at some of the key concepts and points of focus in each of the 4 domains in the national standards and benchmarks. The first domain is mission and Catholic identity. In this domain, we have 4 standards and 21 benchmarks. Standard 1 says that all Catholic schools have a mission. It drives everything. Everybody knows and understands it. It's easy to find, and it includes clear reference to our Catholic identity, which is going to reference gospel values, Eucharist, faith formation, academic excellence, and service. Standard 2 is one of my very favorite standards in the document. It articulates one of the most powerful themes in the standards and benchmarks, the theme I call both and, which I find to be powerful, demanding, and unique to Catholic schools. This standard, and then others and other benchmarks coming at it, the same idea from different perspectives, support it. This standard and its benchmarks are talking about academic rigor in religious education and religious Catholic identity dimensions in all subjects. So we're saying that in our religion programs, in our theology programs, we incorporate and approach them with the same academic rigor we do every other subject, qualified teachers, up-to-date materials, engaging strategies. And we expect to find in every one of our other academic subjects connections to our religious Catholic identity, connections to moral, ethical issues and questions, connections as appropriate to the deep values of the gospel, connections to Catholic perspectives on the world and on living in the world, connections to how we care and support each student because of who that student is as a human being and part of our educational community. Powerful, a both and standard. Standard 3 is about faith formation for students and pointing out particularly that the faith formation of students must rely on and include adults as role models in faith. Standard 4 is about faith formation for adults, that faculty, staff, parents, we need to be that one of the expectations in a Catholic school is that we are paying attention to supporting the faith formation of parents, faculty, staff, and that we include parents, faculty, staff in the participation in service for social justice. So those are the Catholic identity and mission standards. Then we move to domain 2, governance and leadership. In this domain, we have 2 standards and 13 benchmarks. Standard 5 is about the governing body. It's about the fact that we have responsible responsible, careful governance in Catholic schools, established authority, which collaborates with leadership, bishop, pastor, diocese, and holds the community and itself accountable for all of the important dimensions in the school: fidelity to mission, academic excellence, operations. Standard 6 is about the leadership team, that there is a strong leadership team that is responsible for operationalizing the mission, academic excellence, and sound business organizational practices of the school. Also in the context of collaborating, connecting, holding accountable. The third domain is academic excellence, one close to the hearts of all of us teachers and principals and people who work day in, day out in the school. In this domain, there are 3 standards and 18 benchmarks. Standard 7 is really the packed standard. There are 10 benchmarks for this standard. It's about curriculum. Curriculum that's standard-based, addressing 21st century skills, gospel-infused, using technology to help our students learn, to help them create and critique. Curriculum that is differentiated, taught well by a qualified faculty engaged in continuous growth and learning. That's a lot. Standard 8 is about assessment, about the commitment and the expectation that we would be making instructional decisions on the basis of data, instructional decisions that will increase achievement for each child, so that the assessments are data-based, varied, transparent, just, and used for decisions. And then Standard 9 is about support systems. It's about support outside the classroom to make sure that we are educating and forming the whole child: spiritual, intellectual, psychological, emotional, social, physical, moral, ethical, aesthetic, and that we are providing the support that each child needs to be successful in the school and meet the high expectations. The last domain is operational vitality. Catholic schools are central to the evangelizing mission of the Church, and they are also temporal institutions. Even the best academic program, steeped in Catholic identity, cannot succeed if the building is uninhabitable, or if enrollment is too low and revenue is too scarce to pay the bills, or if we can't offer a salary enough to attract qualified teachers and provide a living wage. So the standards and benchmarks in this domain address critical areas needed for the thriving of the school in its temporal mode. Standard 10 looks at financial planning, that we're doing budgeting using the best practices, that it includes representing the total cost of educating a child, that we're paying attention to revenue sources and to transparency. Standard 11 focuses on human resources, salary, benefits, policies, the commitment to be developing our human resources. Standard 12 is a focus on facilities with an emphasis on plans that are tied to mission and program, so that we would have facilities, equipment, technology plans that work on how we're going to develop that dimension of the school, not for its own sake, but in order to accomplish the mission and provide an excellent program. And then finally, Standard 13 is about communication, marketing, enrollment, management, and advancement, that these things be planned, coordinated, and results-oriented.
Lorraine?
Yes?
We have a question, and this might be a good time for it. Gretchen asked, do we have a good definition for 21st century skills? And my answer would be that they're skills that can be applied in all subject areas that include critical thinking, basic knowledge, great work habits, perseverance, and ability to collaborate and communicate. So that's kind of mine in a very broad broad sense of the term of 21st century skills. Do you have anything you want to add to that, or have a different definition?
No, I think those are excellent. They are the skills that look to the higher order thinking skills, that look to having students know how to use the subject matter that they're working with beyond sort of the routine problems, just the fill in the blank kinds of things, but actually to be able to develop skills that allow them to do non-routine work, things that they need to transfer, to be multidisciplinary, to transfer knowledge and learning from one area to another, connecting with all that we hear so much about. Right now we're faced with preparing children, preparing young people for jobs that don't even exist yet, to solve problems that we haven't articulated using tools that are still not created. It's the change in the pace means that we need to have those skills Kathy articulated so well, well beyond remembering things, and I think that's where it goes. Well, I don't have it right in front of me, but one of the benchmarks in in Standard 7 articulates, has a number of verbs and descriptions that tie into a lot of those 21st century skills. So it might be 7.3 so you can look at that benchmark and see what that says for further information. Anything else, Kathy?
No, that's really, the others have been ones that we are pretty general and we've been able to answer. So you can go ahead and talk to us about Catholic identity.
Okay. This multicolored cross here I use as a symbol of pulling together. Then we've looked at some of the key concepts and points of focus in the standards and benchmarks. When I began working with schools and dioceses in implementing the standards after the standards were published, early on, one of the teachers said, you know, could I ask you in your work with this, what do you think is really new? What's really exciting to you about these standards and benchmarks? And I had to think a minute because I hadn't thought of the question that way. And here's what I would say in response to that. When you take the 4 domains, the standards and benchmarks in those 4 big areas, what these standards and benchmarks are saying, I think, really powerfully is that Catholic identity is all of this. So Catholic identity is not just about whether we have crucifixes on the wall and religious art, whether we're doing retreats for kids and service projects. All of those are powerfully important, and if they're missing, we have real work to do. There is a real problem. I'm not diminishing those. But to me, part of the power of having these standards and benchmarks is to acknowledge that it's about those things, but it's also about our commitment to excellence in everything we do, our commitment to collaborate, to use data to make decisions, to use the best tools of the age to teach our students and to secure a future for our schools. It's all Catholic identity. And to me, that gives us just a powerful vision of what we can be working on together. So that was a thumbnail of where the standards came from, why they are important, and what's in them. You probably know that in spring of 2012, when they were published, Father Garanzini funded the mailing of a copy of the standards to all Catholic school principals, to all the bishops, to all the superintendents, and to many presidents of Catholic colleges and universities. The standards are available online at the Catholic School Standards Project website, and additional copies can be ordered of the bound spiral copies can be ordered from NCEA through the publications department. Okay, second part of the webinar today, this evening, is about implementation. From the beginning, we always saw the Catholic School Standards Project as having 3 phases. The first was development and dissemination of the standards, the second implementation, and the third collaborative action. 2 and 3 really are going on together, and there's a lot going on in this area. So I want to take a little bit of time to highlight some of the ways in which schools and dioceses, stakeholders, people vested in Catholic, interested in Catholic education are using the standards and benchmarks so that it might spark ideas for you on how you might use them in your school or diocese. The implementation is local, regional, national. Schools are using them to build awareness, to have conversations about the defining characteristics or one of the benchmarks or a standard, to say, why is this important? Where does it come from? How does it fit here? What do we mean by it? Great conversations. They're using it for assessment. Where do we stand in relation to this benchmark or this characteristic? Using things like surveys and rubrics, collecting data about what is our school performance. Using it for action in planning, strategic planning, school improvement planning, to build our capacity to do even better for our students. And accountability, being used actually in accreditation or school evaluation. I like to talk about the standards implementation reach because it's impressive and extensive. The standards are endorsed by NCEA. So when Kathy's doing her work, when Regina's working with board, there's a fundamental underlying foundation of coming back to these standards. The standards are embedded in accreditation processes, and I'll share more about that in a minute. They are being used by Catholic conferences in their school evaluation and recognition programs. The standards are grounding strategic planning in some dioceses and archdioceses. They're driving school improvement planning in schools, shaping Catholic institutions of higher education programs, inspiring research, and impacting internationally. So can you tell I'm proud that we're doing a lot with these standards? All right, let me get a little more specific as I would go through that list again, just to give you some more ideas. Again, this is not to say any one of these is the cat's pajamas alone, but it might give you some ideas of what you can do. You may know that Advanced Ed approached us early on in the process and said that they would like to use the standards and benchmarks in their accreditation of Catholic schools. And so in fact, they have set up their accreditation protocols for Catholic schools and for diocesan accreditation so that they have embedded the standards and all 70 benchmarks into their accreditation protocols. Now, as of the fall, over 1,300 schools, 66 archdioceses, and 10 small Catholic school systems have begun using Advanced Ed, using the Catholic criteria within Advanced Ed. Now, I'll say at this point, maybe I'll anticipate a question. In the previous webinar, someone asked, are we connecting with any of the other accrediting agencies, with Middle States or New England or the West? And the answer is we would certainly like to. I have had conversations with some folks in Middle States. My colleague, Dr. Patricia Weitzel O'Neill at Boston College, has had conversations with New England accreditation. We have made it clear that we would be happy to work with them in any way that would help them be able to incorporate these standards so that the Catholic schools in their accrediting districts could benefit from this approach. And currently, no great progress has been made. So I would say if any of you are from those other areas and would find it useful to you to have greater embedding of the standards and benchmarks in the accreditation process, you probably would carry a lot of weight to simply ask if enough people ask, you never know what can happen. But I want to say we are we who have been working with the standards and leading the implementation really would welcome that, because it's a way for Catholic schools to be accredited on the unique characteristics of Catholic schools while getting a broader national accreditation and not having to do two separate processes.
And Lorraine, I would just add that because it's so difficult, we cannot separate the Catholic part of our work, and so having one accreditation process makes sense. That question had come up, so thank you for addressing it.
Good. Okay, continuing with our examples, as I said earlier, there are some Catholic conferences. I know I've had conversations with people from the Wisconsin Catholic Conference, Florida, Ohio, Texas, Indiana, a few. They have really been looking at the standards, using the standards to align their processes for accrediting Catholic schools and Catholic identity approval, aligning them with the standards so that there would be that broader base. There are dioceses that are conducting both long-term strategic planning and shorter-term school improvement planning using the domains, the 4 big domains, and the standards to organize their work, so to provide a framework, and using the benchmarks to self-assess current levels of performance. So I know that the Diocese of Palm Beach is quite far along in using these standards and benchmarks to do strategic planning. In the Diocese of Hartford, for example, they took the standards and benchmarks and reworked them in light of work that had already been going on in that diocese to create their strategic plan and standards and benchmarks for their moving forward. As we're talking about planning, I want to say that strategic planning isn't unique to the standards and benchmarks. Most dioceses and schools engage in some kind of periodic strategic planning. You may well be in the middle of some of it right now. So you can continue to do, what you have been doing and what works. Follow the thinking, analysis, decision-making flow that's like this. Usually starts, renew the vision, assess where you are, set goals and priorities, develop a plan, and so on. All that is still very, very true. But what some dioceses and schools are now beginning to do and finding very helpful is to use what's in the standards and benchmarks, the defining characteristics, the standards and benchmarks themselves, as the criteria for quality, as the framework, as that endpoint of where you want to go. So it's doing the strategic planning that you've been doing, but using the standards and benchmarks as the foundation. Similarly with school improvement planning, all of us looking at excellence should be in a continuous school improvement model where you gather, study, gather information and data, you study and analyze it, set some goals, develop an improvement plan, implement it, monitor, evaluate, always with it in mind to be increasing student achievement and Catholic identity. That doesn't change. But in this process, if you're going to use the standards and benchmarks, you'll find them extremely helpful then as providing the framework and the criteria for doing that assessing of quality. And you can use, so using the characteristic standards and benchmarks to gather the data, and then using the tools that we've developed to assist implementation, the perception surveys, the rubrics, the worksheets, guidelines, more things coming to help you do the study and analysis so that you can continue to move forward. Catholic institutions of higher education, we colleges and universities, have leadership programs to help prepare people to be leaders in Catholic schools. And in many cases, I'm using as one example our own case at Loyola University Chicago, we have a Catholic Principal Preparation Program. Candidates in the program earn an MED in instructional leadership, and they're prepared to become licensed principals in the state of Illinois. Well, we at the Center for Catholic School Effectiveness, especially under the direction of Dr. Michael Boyle, we have completely aligned our Catholic Principal Preparation Program with the national standards and benchmarks, so that candidates completing the program are not only ready to be licensed in Illinois, they're ready to be not only the academic and business leaders of the school, they're ready to be the faith leaders of the school as well. Similarly, at the University of Dayton, their REMI Leadership Institute has been aligned to the national standards. And I know there are other Catholic universities that are doing the same kind of aligning. Some of the things that Catholic universities are doing to support Catholic educators have to do with professional development for principals, for teachers. The Roach Center for Catholic Education at Boston College has developed some signature programs for providing professional development for teachers and other school leaders, which they have consciously and deliberately and carefully aligned to the national standards and benchmarks. So there is that reinforcing. CHESS, Catholic Higher Education Supporting Catholic Schools, is a national association of Catholic colleges and universities that have chosen to build deliberate programs to support Catholic educators, either degree programs or professional development programs. A subset of that group, a steering committee with members from Boston College, Loyola Marymount University, Loyola University Chicago, Marquette University, University of Dayton, have begun to work on developing a set of guidelines for interpreting the benchmark rubrics. And I'm going to talk about the benchmark rubrics in a minute. So if you are going to be using the rubrics to assess where your school is in terms of moving toward what's in the standards and benchmarks, the rubrics will help you look at the indicators, look at what you should be looking for. The guidelines will help you make better sense of what you're looking for in the rubric. So it's going a layer down. The steering committee has recently expanded so that we now have working with us some superintendents, some associate superintendents, some representatives from NCEA, and other Catholic education leaders. We're hoping to have a first draft of the guidelines by Easter, and then we will again, as we did with the standards and benchmarks, put them out there to get review from people like yourselves in the field. So when you are giving feedback on this webinar, if you're interested in being someone who would be reviewing these guidelines when they're developed, please put that in your response. Research is another way the standards and benchmarks are beginning to be used. Now that we have an agreed upon, accepted national set of criteria, we may be in the position for the first time to have a real, meaningful, consistent database, to build a database across regions and dioceses that would serve as a basis for doing research to make strong evidence-based cases for the importance and effectiveness of Catholic schools. I've already gotten calls from talking with graduate students who are working on dissertations or theses. We have people in our Catholic cohort EDD at Loyola that are doing action research using the standards as a basis, and there are other plans for research as we go along. Internationally, we are working on getting a well-done, carefully vetted Spanish translation of the standards and benchmarks. We're very close, and so that should be appearing on the Catholic School Standards Project website in the not-too-distant future. At Loyola, we have been working with a group of Catholic educators from the Philippines who want to learn from what we in the United States have done in developing these standards and benchmarks to create a set of standards and benchmarks for their own country. Pretty exciting, I think. Okay, lots going on. You need tools to do it. So I want to just talk about this briefly. All of this is on the Catholic School Standards Project website, which I will put the address up again shortly. These tools are there to help you use the standards and benchmarks in ways that will benefit your school and diocese. So there are perception surveys, rubrics, worksheets, guidelines, apps coming soon, hopefully, and we are very close to forming a national task force that will be working on developing principal and teacher evaluation tools based on the standards and benchmarks. The perception surveys, there are two sets of them, one about the defining characteristics and one called program effectiveness surveys that are about the standards and benchmarks themselves. They've gone through validity and reliability testing, so you can be pretty confident using them. Each set has versions that are designed to focus on parents, faculty, staff, high school students, and upper elementary students. The rubrics, I want to say a word about the rubrics. If you've seen them, you know that these are, I think, really helpful tools. For each benchmark, we created a 4-point rubric, also available on the website, where the benchmark itself is a description of fully meets. Sometimes we've added a sentence or two more of description, but the benchmarks are intended to be statements of excellence. So that's a statement of fully meets. And then we said, okay, but then what else would be in place in a school that exceeds that target? Or what's it like in a school that only partially meets or does not meet? Let me give you a quick example. Standard 3, if you remember, it's about faith formation of students. Benchmark 3.1 says every student is offered timely and regular opportunities to learn about and experience the nature and importance of prayer, the Eucharist, and liturgy. So if we're building a rubric, this is the way we did it. We started with the benchmark at level 3, fully meets. As I said, occasionally we added another sentence or two. For this rubric, we did not. The next step is to say, okay, but then what does it look like if the school exceeds the benchmark? So here we have at level 3, every child is involved in prayer. It's important. It's easily present. At level 4, though, not only are the children learning about prayer and engaging, but they're leading it. They're involved in the design. They take on a variety of roles. It's frequent everywhere, students taking the lead. So you get some real clues about what exceeding looks like. Then at level 2, yes, prayer is present, but it's limited. It's not everywhere and pervasive. And at level 1, either it's not really there or it's perfunctory. You know, every teacher is required to use the Hail Mary before class, but it doesn't mean much. That's the kind of descriptors you'll find in those rubrics. So if you haven't looked at them, after you look at the standards and benchmarks themselves, take a look at how powerful these tools can be for you. On these rubrics, the last thing we did was also indicate possible sources of evidence, because it's easy to say, well, of course we're a 4. We're a good school. We like prayer. We're a 4. You got to be saying to yourself, show me the money. Show me the evidence. If you say you're a 4, show me the schedule of frequent everywhere liturgies. Show me liturgical aids that are designed by students. Show me the roles of kids in those prayers. That's the way we want to be thinking, is what's the evidence? Because this is not a gotcha. It's about where are we? Let's celebrate that and let's move forward. So great tools and sources available on this site. There's the address of the Catholic School Standards Project. Excuse me. This website's going to look very different, probably just in a couple weeks. We're upgrading it, so getting a new look at the top, easier navigation. And as most of you know, the Common Core Catholic Identity Initiative has moved to its own website. So we're going to have a new look. It's going to have the same address. So all of these materials and more as they keep coming will be available on that site. So wrapping up here, what I hope you've been hearing me say is that the standards and benchmarks Position your school to be effective, mission-driven, academically excellent, accountable, operationally vital, and growing. And it's all about having the evidence to tell the story, to improve the story, to publish new stories. When we look at data, we tend to think, oh my gosh, it's going to uncover areas of needed growth. It will, but it will also give us and discover many, many areas to celebrate. So thank you. I hope that you can use the standards and benchmarks as a wonderful framework to improve your excellent schools. It's been a great pleasure being with you tonight.